It's just past 5 o'clock, so we're going to start. Croeso cynnes i chi gyd ma i'r drwm ac i'r Llyfrgell Genedlaethol heno. Croeso hefyd i bawb sy'n ymuno gyda ni ar-lein. Hi, I'm Rhian Gibson, Director of Communications, Partnerships and Engagement here at the library. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening, and a big welcome also to those joining us online, and I understand there are quite a few of you as well. Tonight is the launch of an incredible book, Many Roads, Women's Personal Stories of Courage and Displacement in Wales. The book is a collection of stories and experiences of immigrant, migrant and refugee women from Asia and Africa who have settled in Wales. It celebrates their lives and courage. It is published by Honno Welsh Women's Press and is on sale here tonight, as you've probably seen. After buying the book this lunchtime, it's been a challenge for me all afternoon to try and carry on with my work, rather than immerse myself in these amazing stories, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more and to be able to read the book when I get home tonight. Around 2 weeks ago, Professor Charlotte Williams was standing here delivering the annual Welsh Political Lecture. And she has written the foreword to the stories in the book. She ends by saying, "These are bold accounts that speak to the unequivocal fact that migrants bring skills, innovations, new perspectives and experiences to Wales, that they are adaptable, courageous and resilient, and that Wales has, does and will benefit from this diversity." So there's a lot to look forward to this evening, and it is my pleasure to welcome the book's editor, Faiza Jasdanwala Williams, co-compiler Chinyere Chukwudioke here to the drum this evening, and to Mohini Gupta, also a co-compiler, who will be joining us on the screen. Many contributors to the book will be also taking part this evening. But first, can I welcome Faiza to the stage, who will be giving more detailed introductions to everybody who's taking part and what will happen for the rest of the evening. So a very warm welcome, and please enjoy.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Rhian, am eich cyflwyniad garedig. Croeso cynnes i chi gyd i lansiad llyfr Many Roads noswaith yma. Diolch am dod o beth ac agos. Da ni'n diolchgar iawn i Llyfrgell Genedlaethol Cymru am gynnal digwyddiad hwn, a diolch arbennig i Dan Jones am trefnu popeth heddi. So a very warm welcome to all of you for this book launch of Many Roads, and thank you so much for coming from near and afar. We also are very grateful to the National Library of Wales for hosting this event today, and to Dan Jones for arranging everything and making sure that everything's in hand for the event to proceed. I would also like to thank BCW, Books Council Wales, all the Honno committee members and all the Honno staff for all their support, their help, their advice and encouragement throughout this project. A very big thank you to Rebecca Parfitt, our commissioning editor, who I think has joined us online, for kind of overseeing the project, for all her advice and her hard work in making sure that all the deadlines were met. Many thanks to Lindsay Fitzpatrick, our business manager, for arranging and organizing all the complicated logistics for today. Thank you, Lindsay, and for doing such a super job with the promotion and marketing of this book. And also thanks to Lindsay's partner for helping out today as well. A very special thank you to Professor Charlotte Williams, as Rhiannon already mentioned, for honoring us with an excellent foreword to our book. And I think Professor Charlotte Williams is also online today. We were really fortunate to receive some brilliant endorsements for our book from Professor Ken Booth, Emeritus Professor of International Politics at Aberystwyth University and Fellow of the British Academy. Andrew Whitehead, who's the former BBC India correspondent and co-editor, along with Mohini Gupta, of the Hindu Bard, also published by Hono Press. And Professor Shihan De Silva Jayasuriya, a long-standing scholar of the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean. In fact, Professor Shihan De Silva has a film screening on the same subject, a film that she's directed, being shown tomorrow at the Aberystwyth University Visualization Center at 2 p.m. So if you're free, please do go along. I can promise it will be very interesting. And I'm really delighted that two of our endorsers, Professor Ken Booth and Professor Shihan De Silva, are here with us today for this event. Thank you very much for coming. And I cannot proceed without thanking my co-compilers, Chinyere Chukwudi Oke and Mohini Gupta, from whom you will hear very shortly. But most of all, a huge thanks goes to our contributors, without whom there would be no book. This book would just not exist. It is their belief and trust in us to tell their stories accurately, with compassion and with empathy, that this has been possible. So thank you very much to all the contributors for making the journey today and joining us. And you'll be hearing a little more about their stories during the course of this event as well. And last but so not the least, a very special thanks to my brother Arshad and my sister-in-law Shireen and my dear friends since childhood for coming all the way from Bombay to support me today for this event. And I can't begin to say how much it means to me. It means the world. Just to say that Shireen's sari, the design on Shireen's sari that she's wearing today, has made it on the cover of many roads. So a short word on the cover as well, because I requested my family and friends from the different parts of the world that the contributors originate from to send in images and photos of some of the very traditional designs, motifs on fabric or textile or any other medium to me. And I sent that off to our designer via Rebecca Parfit. And our designer has done such a fantastic job with the cover, with those images. So thanks also to my friends and family who sent in those images in the first place, because we wouldn't have had such a stunning cover otherwise. So I'd just like to say a few words about how this project actually came about and the thought processes behind it. Ever since the war in Syria and the crisis of displacement that it resulted in, I became increasingly upset seeing and hearing about the horrors that millions of people were having to endure, suddenly being forced out of their stable lives, and in so many cases, just having to leave behind their loved ones, is something that so many of us cannot even begin to contemplate. Sure, we got news reports, but we rarely ever heard from the people who were affected, the people who had to go through that ordeal. In all of this, I began thinking that some of the most marginalized voices were those of refugee women, those of women who are seeking asylum, who have fled for various reasons from their stable lives. As the refugee influx increased throughout Europe and the UK, I also became really horrified by the negative and at times hateful rhetoric that we were hearing constantly about refugees. This then became even more complicated as it became tied into general negative comments about immigrants and migrants. Now, being an immigrant myself from India, I was finding it so difficult to just sit back, listen quietly to all of this without even attempting to try and present an alternative narrative. In conjunction with this, as an historian of early modern Ottoman women and of the African diaspora in India, I became involved in quite a few events organized by the UN and contributed to publications by UNESCO to celebrate the UN International Decade for People of African Descent, 2015 to 2024. So this is the last year of the UN International Decade. And I began thinking that it's quite important to contribute in some way to this decade as well, to the body of writing that was ongoing for those 10 years. And I began thinking along the lines of African women who have now settled in Wales. And all of this spurred me on to kind of propose to the Honor Committee a nonfiction anthology that would bring to the fore the voices and stories of immigrant, migrant, and refugee women from Africa and Asia in order to combine the various thought processes. And in this way, it would not only contribute in part to the UN International Decade, but would also bring to the fore the voices of these women that we otherwise would not have heard. In so many cases, our contributors lead fairly normal lives, ordinary lives, away from the public eye, and we would probably not have heard their stories or known about their stories. But these are, without fail, every story is one that we all should know. In doing all this, in preparing this anthology, we also managed to get to kind of gauge the level of comfort that these women have achieved in their new environments, the extent to which they feel welcomed in their new communities, and most importantly, how enriched they make their new environments as well. So after all, it's a two-way process. They are absorbing, in various degrees, to be fair, the culture of the country that they now call home. But at the same time, they're imparting their own culture into the society in which we all live, and thereby enriching that society. In this entire endeavor, we have been so fortunate to receive the New Audiences Fund grant from BCW, which has allowed us to recruit 2 women to assist me in forging direct links, reaching out to various immigrant, migrant, and refugee communities across Wales, and encouraging women within these communities to tell their story. And these 2 women are Chinyere Chukwudi and Mohini Gupta. Their assistance on this project has been invaluable. As the proposer, a compiler, and the editor of this book, it has been an absolute honor to work on this book and see it come to fruition. And I hope that it is a huge success and many, many, many more people get to read the remarkable stories in this anthology. I will now hand over to Mohini, I think, has sent a video in to talk about her experiences of working on this project. And after that, Chinyere will say a few words. Thank you very much.
Shemai Bau. Hello, everyone. Diolkan Baur, Zod Ama Hedyu. Thank you so much for coming here today to join us for the launch of this wonderful book titled Many Roads. It has been almost 2 years since I first heard about the idea of this book, and I've been hooked ever since. As someone from India who has spent a brief stint in Wales, I experienced firsthand the cultural similarities between India and Wales, and also the distance that I felt from my own culture and city while I was there. And it was really this dichotomy that defined my own experience in Wales and continued to influence my journey as a PhD student when I came back to the UK and I studied Indian and Welsh language politics at Oxford. So I wondered if this short experience could mean so much to me. What about journeys of women who've traveled to Wales from across Asia, Africa, Middle East, navigated so many more tensions and complex dynamics to be here? What have they faced? How has Wales accepted them? How have they accepted Wales? And how does this sort of cultural cross-pollination work across regional contexts? Faiza, who's the editor of this book and my dear, dear friend, was keen to ask these questions by compiling this anthology, and I was keen to join her in this quest. So I'm really, really grateful that I could be a part of this book. Which is actually my second project with Hono Press after co-authoring The Hindu Bard with them, which we launched right here at the Drum last year. I'm also so grateful to Chinyere, who joined us very soon after and brought her unique perspectives and connections that added so much nuance and richness to the book. So I'm really grateful to all of you, and thank you so much for letting me be a part of this journey. I also just want to say that the experience of reaching out to identifying, at times having to convince women to share their stories despite their personal challenges and hesitations was quite a task. Some of them actually had to withdraw their stories because of difficult circumstances. Some even shared their stories with us despite some dangers that faced them. Some stories were gut-wrenching, some equally uplifting. And I think that's what makes this collection so unique and so diverse, and also quite informative because it covers such a wide range of experiences. I've personally learned a lot from the women that I interviewed in this process, who became friends along the way as well. So I just want to say, if you are here now and if you're listening, thank you so much for trusting us with your story and for trusting that we will tell it the right way. So I'm really excited that this book is now all of yours to hold. I'm confident that it will reshape and broaden your own understanding of Wales, because Wales to me isn't a single story. Wales is composed of a multitude of stories that it holds within it. And I'm just so glad that this book can showcase a sliver of that diversity. So we really hope that you enjoy reading these stories. Do let us know what you think and have a fantastic time at the launch today. I'm going to end by reading something from my own chapter in the book, which is titled Finding Bollywood in Vriog. And it starts by talking about celebrating Diwali in Wales, which is a coincidence because it is Diwali week in India here as well now. It was a cold November in Aberystwyth, and I was homesick. This happened a day before Diwali in 2017. I usually pride myself on being independent and detached from name, place, animal, things, but this festival of lights always makes me nostalgic for home and family in a way that's completely inexplicable. The thought of home for me is tied intricately to food. The only cure for homesickness, in my understanding, is food. It can transport you back in time to people, to places, to memories. I had tried many restaurants in and around Aberystwyth to satiate this irrational search for food, which would help manage my nostalgia. But I'd been disappointed on every occasion. When I mentioned that it was Diwali and that I was dying to eat authentic Indian food to my friend Katrin, she offered to drive me to a restaurant which was up the coast from Aberystwyth, a place that she thought might be authentic. Now, I trust Katrin's taste in food, so I took a leave of absence for the day from my Welsh tutor and decided to take this leap of faith. After a long and winding drive up to Fairborn, we arrived at this restaurant called Indiana Cuisine. Imagine my surprise when I walked in and bumped into a familiar-looking face from Bollywood, our host for the evening and the owner of the restaurant. He was as delighted to see me, another Indian, especially someone who recognized him immediately in these remote parts, and ended up sharing his Yadon Ki Barat photo album with me. There were pictures of him with famous Bollywood celebrities, including the likes of Shah Rukh Khan, Salman Khan, Sanjay Dutt. It even included letters that some of them had written to him. He talked at length about his mama, as maternal uncles are called in India, and it was only later that I realized that he was talking about the Marlon Brando of Indian cinema, Amitabh Bachchan. It may not be an apt comparison, but I cannot think of another Western icon who could represent what Bachchan means to Indian cinema. I had always known the actor-restaurateur by his screen name, Master Mayur. He was well known in India for having portrayed the young Bachchan in some of his most celebrated movies like Diwar and Namak Halal. It was only now that I found out his real name was Raj, the ultimate romantic name for connoisseurs of Hindi cinema. His wife, Noori, was the chef de cuisine. I'm going to leave it there so that you can be curious about knowing more about Noori. And for that, you must pick up the book and read the story. So I really hope that you enjoy this evening. Thank you again for letting me be a part of this. And yeah, have fun. Thank you so much.
Please come up.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chinyere Chukwudi-Oke, and I'm one of the co-compilers of Many Roads. There's something my father used to say while I was growing up in Nigeria. He would say that tomorrow is pregnant and holds the possibility of miracles. It's usually something he says to console us during difficult situations. And that has been something that has informed everything in my life. The fact that there is a hope somewhere there that we can hang on to like an anchor. And that is actually the journey of this book, Many Roads, because it is the many roads to how women from different parts of the world are becoming in Wales. And it is worth celebrating the fact that Wales, being majorly a city, a country of sanctuary, can actually hold so many dreams and hold it all together. And I would like to say that compiling this book has been quite an emotional journey, because when we started, it was like a big idea by Faiza, and she put it forward to Hono. Hono embraced it, and then it found a home with the Book Council of Wales New Audiences Fund, and over time, the dream came alive, roughly, but beautiful at the end. And it's been quite rough because we started out thinking that there's a straitjacket to how we can do this project. But along the way, we realized that there are different ways to do it. And if we were to go with the pattern that we had in mind, we will be showcasing the stories of women who have the currency of expression and possibly forget about those of them who are unable to tell their stories. So over time, what we did was to find a way to make sure that the book is as representative as possible. If we needed to get a translator to translate, we get a translator to translate, because there are women who may not have the currency of expression in English language, but can tell their stories in their local languages. And if they have the grace of a translator, it would be very good for them to also be part of the Many Roads. And it was very, it's a journey that kind of, that is very empowering, because some of these women have never really done something this big. It may be to us as a very simple project, easy to do, but for these women, it's a very, very big and monumental, pardon me in the use of that word, achievement for them, because this will be the first tangible thing they will hold in their hands and call their own and tell themselves that they are part of something very big. I remember the experience of speaking with one of the contributors. She's from Iran, and she told her story, and as she was talking, the translator was translating in English, and she was crying But the way the translator passed the message to me, it didn't evoke any form of tears from me. But I had to look at her and tell myself that if you're going to tell the story in her voice and be able to write it on her behalf, it must be told in her voice. So what I did was to use the recording. I got home and I was in a very melancholic state because I had to revoke the memory, just bring up the memory of that lady crying in order to capture the feeling that came with that very story. And it's been a blessing and an eye-opening one for me, because sometimes you stay in your part of the world and you think that you have the biggest problems in the world, and then you hear other people's stories and you realize that yours is just barely scratching the surface. But that doesn't actually reduce the depth of your story, but it makes you to be more grateful and more appreciative of how far you have come, because there are other people who are still struggling to actually get to the place where you are. And another thing I would say about Many Roads is the fact that coming to Wales for me, I've had to travel to Wales through the pages of books. I've been to China through Kazuo Ishiguro's books. I've been to India through Arundhati Roy Alkajoshi. I've been to different parts of the world by just reading books. I just told one of our contributors today that, do you know I've been to Zambia? I mean, I've read Kenneth Kaunda. So it kind of exposes you to the ways of the world. But the blessing of this is that it also tells you how journeys from different parts of the world kind of come together in Wales and connect, and you see our shared humanity and how all of us are actually braving the odds and becoming in Wales. And it wasn't just Many Roads initially, it was integrated. And I thought, integrated? But over time, by sheer miracle or intervention, it became Many Roads. And it's quite beautiful because all of us have come from different routes, different roads to come to Wales. And, you know, it's a very, very representative title. And I must, appreciate whoever designed the book, because it captures the fabrics, because our stories are like fabrics woven together. It captures the fabrics of these women, the places they are coming from, the continents that are represented, from Asia to Africa to the Middle East. And both the front and the back captures all of these fabrics, and then how we have been able to weave our stories into one collection, Many Roads. So I want to appreciate Faiza for coming up with this idea and giving me the opportunity to be on this project. I also want to thank Kono Publishers. I've had to, pardon me, I need to blow my trumpet a little bit. I've featured in one of their collections, Lipstick Eyebrows. I thought that would be the last, and then this song came on. I applied alongside Mohini, and somehow, I don't know how, we got in, and it's been a wonderful experience. It's been a learning process, and I really, really appreciate it. When I came to Wales from Nigeria, I didn't know the many doors that could open up, the many opportunities to see wonderful people like you that come from different places, different walks of life. I mean, I never imagined that I'll be standing here to talk about a book that I co-compiled. And for some of these women, it's the same thing, because none of us actually saw it that we'll be able to contribute to something beautiful. This is a dream. This is a dream. This is beautiful. And I like the fact that these opportunities are opening up to all of us, and we are seeing our potentials. And if you have ever told yourself for some reason that nothing, or maybe you will never be able to achieve much in Wales, being a foreign land, I'm sorry. This is a journey that will open up many other doors, and you're just starting, and other wonderful things are going to follow. And I want to encourage every woman here that as much as this Many Roads have opened up new roads for us, I want us to embrace it, because you are worth it. And I'm going to read a little bit from my part of the story, which is not so beautiful. Yeah. I really don't know where to read from, but I'm going to try. All right. Some days, I would approach anyone carrying a box. By the way, my story is titled Around Wales with My Heart in My Hands. Some days I would approach anyone carrying a box or bags, demanding to know if they were moving out of their apartments, as I would love to move in. After days of failure, I realized that my family and I would have to return to our tiny room in the attic of some student chambers in Maritime Quarters to regroup and re-strategize. I'll move to another place. I want to take it in bits and pieces. And the roof came crumbling down. There is a proverb in my native Nigerian parlance that a bird in hand is worth 1,000 in the bush. This house, with all its shambles and disarray, became our treasured bird in hand as the hope of his renewal and redemption through thorough overhauling and painting became our hope. We got the permission of our new agents and landlord to inform our current impatient and disgruntled agents that our move was near and they could now hold their horses and retreat from their threat. The threat that we would one day come home and realize we have been locked out and the locks changed. So I studied the real estate laws in Swansea, which offered some protection somewhat. But nonetheless, I was more restless than the owners of the current house to move and breathe freely in a new and befitting living space. I'll move. When we moved into the house, it came with mixed feelings. We knew we deserved better as everything looked like it was hanging precariously. First, it was an old house. And to add to that, it had an eerie ambience of a house on the verge of caving in. The staircase groaned with every movement of our feet, and some of the doors creaked as though balanced on rusted hinges, which they were. The kitchen cabinets were old and outdated, and there were no white goods in the house. There was no extractor fan, no cooking set, no fridge, no washing machine, and of course, the heating system didn't function during winter. For days after we moved in, we had to buy a makeshift manual heater from one of the shops, and the entire family assembled into one room to share each other's warmth and the artificial heat from the single heater. The toilet had congealed excrement for which the owner of the house had provided us with bleach to clean it. Then the bathroom sinkhole was just an empty hole with no drain holes or any drain at all, just a wide gaping hole that stared you in the face like a horror movie. It was the peak of winter, and the house inside felt as cold and sometimes even colder than the temperature outside. Let me move to the end. Let's go to happy endings. As I continue to explore all my possibilities in Wales, opening myself and creativity to diverse expressions, I do so with my heart in my hands, all around Wales, with my fragile heart in my hands. Thank you. And so to charge up the atmosphere a little bit, I got the permission of Hona and Faiza to, present a little poem. It's titled Many Roads to Becoming. From distant shores, we have come, holding memories like stones in our pockets, settling in Cardiff's bustling streets, under Swansea's grey and generous skies, along quiet paths of Wrexham and Bangor, in towns where strangers become neighbors and then sisters. They come bearing stories threaded with loss, stories shaped by each border crossed. Some speak of mountains left behind and turbulent seas crossed at night. Others say nothing, their silence holding all that cannot be said. Here among fields and forests, in voices carried by Welsh winds, they find pieces of sanctuary, not in whole, but just enough. Their children learn new words, dream new dreams, and stretch into new spaces, planting fragments of home in the soil of a country new to them. It is said in Africa that to see the world, you must be like the masquerade, never dancing on the spot, but defying odds. Many roads is the embroidery, and here lies the binaries of how we are becoming in Wales: the good, the bad, the triumphs, the travails, the struggles, and the tiny miracles. So today we speak in the tongue of resilience, tales of lives uprooted, regrown, and then reinvented. In Wales, like an injured deer, we find our feet again. We rise to fill the room, this very room, with melodies of our journey across many roads, the many roads taken to becoming in Wales. Thank you.
Now we would like to invite our contributors to say a few words about their stories. So I think, Chinyere, would you like to start off with Amber and Sweeta, maybe?
Okay, so I have the honor to introduce these two women to you. Amber Esther is a woman of many talents. She has been the face of the Swansea City of Sanctuary and at some points the chair. She has worked closely with me at the African Community Center. She had to flee from abuse from Pakistan all the way to Wales, and she has reinvented herself in so many ways. She has 2 children. She's a grandmother of 2. If I don't say that, she will kill me. And today is actually her birthday. What a coincidence. And she currently works with SCVS. She helps in so many ways to on the Better Welcome project to improve the lives of people moving from different parts of the world to Swansea. Amber, please, you have the stage. And then I have the honor of introducing the second woman. Though she hasn't worked with me at the African Community Center, which, by the way, has the name African, but trust me, I have met people from Iran, Afghanistan, Kuwait, India, Pakistan, and she is from Afghanistan. I remember her story and the loneliness of her journey, getting her family over here, driving a car in the streets where women barely drive cars, and being scared but braving the odds and coming to Wales. She has contributed immensely to the African Community Center and has done a lot for us in terms of women empowerment, sharing our stories, using our lives and our stories as a roadmap to encourage other women. Please help me welcome Sweeta Durrani. So we'll be doing it in batches of 2. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to start with Amber. The title of Amber's contributing a memoir, because this is a collection of short memoirs, is titled The Many Roads to Becoming, A Journey from Pakistan to Wales. Amber, I have a question for you, and hopefully the audience will also have something to ask you, and I would like to ask, have you taken any further steps towards adopting counseling as a profession to help other women and girls?
Yes, 100%. Because my first job as a paid job with ACC, African Community Center. And first of all, I would like to mention that African Community Center, they put immensely, invested me a lot of things. So when someone introduced me African Community Center in 2013, I was the first Asian woman in African Community Center. And I felt, oh, okay, well, somewhere we have to start our life. So, yeah. So, 10 years I spent as a volunteer and helping other women in counseling sessions, one-to-one and group counseling. And then last year I found a job called Better Welcome Project. So this is a council job, but the project is for when people are arriving in Swansea in Wales. So I welcome them and introduce what is Swansea actually. Swansea is the second city in Wales as a Century Seekers. So yes, I'm encouraging every single person who arrives in Swansea. I meet them face to face, I introduce what Wales is like, that what I have seen through my eyes.
Okay.
So yeah, so taking them to another steps.
Yeah, I would like to ask, before you do a little reading from the book, what languages, because you're a counseling interpreter, what languages do you translate?
So I speak Punjabi, I speak Hindi and Urdu, I speak little bit Sindhi as well, because I'm originally from Karachi, Pakistan, so Sindh province. So yeah.
Okay. My second and last question, what type of activities are you currently involved in, and how integrated do you feel? I know you mentioned the activities. How integrated do you feel in Swansea?
Swansea is a home. Wales is home for us because I would like to mention recently when I visited back home. So one day I was saying to my mom, oh, I'm tired, I want to go home. And my mom said, home is home, you are at home. So no, home where I belong to. So yesterday, me and my son, we were talking about home. That home where we feel safe. Home is where we feel belonging. In fact, I spent 33 years back home, but my ties are here now. I feel that Wales and Welsh people, they invested, they welcomed me with warm heart. And when I started with City of Century, so if you heard about City of Century, is a movement. So Swansea City of Century, I started with them from 2014. And then step by step, when I become co-chair of the Swansea City of Century, so I was on a speaker team. I was encouraging people to tell their stories, because that's the only way we can encourage and tell what we are, who we are. And sometimes, you know, that people, they don't feel, they are shattered because they are coming from different backgrounds, and they don't feel that, okay, they're a bit shy or might be people judge. No, when you are tell how many different boats, how many different countries' borders you cross. So this is not only many roads, it's a many borders we crossed. And the thing is that in this journey, we lost so many memories, so many things, so many belongings, because sometimes people, when they are fleeing from their countries, they have to leave their loved ones, they have to leave their belongings. And the thing is that when I become, I feel like that I am Welsh. I cannot speak Welsh, I'm really sorry, but I'm learning. But my children, they can. And now my grandchildren, my granddaughter, she started school, so I'm hoping that they can. So one day, yeah. So.
All right. So Amber, can you read a little bit, you know, from your story?
Yes. So I wanted to read a little two parts, which are really from my story. So I painted my dreams in color, a spectrum of satirically appalling couture. Today I'm not in competition with anyone, nor I am trying to overshadow someone else's achievements. I am just striving to be a better person than what I was yesterday. I'm a peer mentor, and God has enabled me to help many other time-battered women like the one I was. And I felt this is very deeply for me because I arrived battered and shattered without very low English speaking, because where I came from, it wasn't like giving me opportunity to speak English. I was a trained nurse, but I couldn't work. But God brings me here, and He given me that appointed place, and He given me that time. And I currently working with Swansea Council Voluntary Services, and I feel so proud that here I am, and there are many roles and achievements for us and for my family.
Okay. Please, a round of applause for Amber. Pardon me if I appear slightly awkward. I may look comfortable, but I'm a bundle of nerves. All right. So, sweetheart, do you have the book with you? Or you need my copy? I can. Yeah. While you're talking, I could help you find the page. Don't worry.
Yeah, I can find 25. I remember.
Okay, thank you. All right. So, is there any progress now on the possibility of your mother and sisters joining you in Wales at last? Has there been any form of breakthrough?
Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to big thank you for everyone to support us and to support people, individual, hear our voice. So, yes, you will read my story, but I want to say after this story, progress in my family reunion, yes. After many years, nearly 6 years, I could bring all of my family over, and now all of them is here with me, and I'm really, really blessed.
Okay. And I would like to ask, have you managed to restart your business? You had a thriving business back in Pakistan where you used to help women. Is it the same sort of business and that you had in Pakistan? And could you tell us a little bit? Afghanistan, sorry. Amber, you keep confusing me. Let me focus. All right. Could you tell us a little more about how the business you were involved in when you were still in Afghanistan?
So when I was in Afghanistan, it wasn't easy for women in Afghanistan to doing a job, especially in business, but we tried and we did fight a lot in our community with a group of women in Afghanistan. And I did two kind of business in Afghanistan. But when I came to the UK, the first I thought when I decided to stay here, and then I decided to restart my businesses. But everything is completely different from Afghanistan, the procedure and the rules, everything. So I had got enough experience in business, and but in here I rebuilt my knowledge about the business. I started a business training in here. When I during that training, so many people told me we will support you to start your business. But after I finished that training, nobody have done anything for me, and that's why I couldn't restart my business in here. I had and still I have lots of good business idea in my mind, but it is not easy, especially for migrants, especially for the people they don't have long time visa. I got after a very short time, after 4 months or 5 months, I got leave to remain, got refugee status. But with that status, I couldn't give any support from the government, and that's why I couldn't start my business. But now, after nearly 6 years, I changed my mind, because in the last 5 years, 6 years, I did fight a lot because of my family in the family reunion case way, and now I changed my mind. Now I see that Swita can help people in this way, not in business, in the family reunion process. And now I started my again my study about the law and immigration. Hopefully I can in the next few years I believe to myself and I will start my career in this case.
Okay, thank you. So can you read a little bit from your story, maybe a portion of your story that resonates with everything you've said?
Okay. I got married at 13. It was a forced marriage. Although I was coerced into the union, it was standard force for Afghan girls. So, do you want to continue?
So it's been an amazing time speaking with two of our contributors, and I must say that we are happy that you trusted us with your stories, and thank you very much for trusting Hono, Faiza, Mohini, and I with your stories. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I would now like to invite Anam Munavar and Tehmeena Khan on stage, please. Anam is from Malaysia, from the city of Kuching, which is often called Cat City. So the story in the book, the title is From Cat City to the Fort on the River Taff. She spent 16 years of her life in Malaysia and then came to Cardiff for her further education. Anam is visually impaired and faced a lot of bullying in school, but she has risen how. Now when she came to Cardiff, she studied pharmacy, practiced pharmacy, but now she works with RNIB. So her story is another remarkable one. Anam, please come on stage. Tehmeena is from Bangladesh, and she accompanied her husband to Wales and started her journey into social work. And she has spent most of her life doing as a social worker, and she is still going strong with social work and absolutely contributing to the community in which she lives and beyond. Tehmeena, please come up on stage. I'll start with Tehmeena. Tehmeena, you said that you were planning to start a counseling service for young Black and Asian children, especially. So, has that got off the ground now? Is that?
Yes. first of all, I just want to thank all the initiatives to allowing me to contribute to this. It seems like a dream to me, really, that there is a story of mine here, which I just taken it to granted, but it's just in a paper. So I want to thank you, and also thank you to allowing me to speak. So in terms of, so I've been social work qualified since 1995, but my work with the community began in 1987 and as a voluntary. And through my time, my area of social work is family placement, fostering adoption. So where the Black and Asian children can be placed in transracial placement, or with the same-race placement, and children coming into care. So we have seen that these children are coming from, of course, very troubled background, very much disadvantaged background, and also children who are not in care system, as well as in the community, Black community, that the children come from very disadvantaged background. The parents are, with poverty, and they are not able to help with the children. So many of these young people are really having very difficult start. And going back to the placements with the fostering and adoption, sometimes these children are really then losing their identity. They live, they suffer an identity crisis. When they live in care, they not only then feel themselves as white person or black, so they really not accepted by any of these communities. So. And having severe, mental health issues, and some of the community issues. I said the young people, Black and ethnic minority children, they get into the addiction area. So the counseling is very much needed. This is high increase in the community that they need the counseling, but the services are very, very, limited. There are only white psychologists or psychotherapists who are not able to understand sometimes where they're coming from. So colleague of mine, three of the social workers started this initiative. So we already nearly there. We are now just a registered charity. It's called Amani Counseling Service. So we got, enrolled therapist, psychologist, and then we will be got on the ground in next year. Hopefully, we're working on the bank account and all the logistics at the moment. Yeah. So I'll be really. And in Wales, I think it's only another one. I think I heard of one more. But the need is so much in the community. Excuse me.
Would you like some water? Yeah.
That I thought, working in the community for so long, we want to make a difference, really make a difference to help out, basically. So setting up this counseling service for Black and Asian children would be really, really, really impactful, I think.
You had also said initially that when you started your social work and especially helped Bangladeshi women in the community, you were labeled sometimes as a troublemaker because you were trying to help them seek their rights and stuff. Has that changed now with the changing attitudes?
Yes, I mean, we, as I said, that we started in early 90s with the project in Barbados, where there's a women's center, multicultural center. And at the time, there is very limited resources. Again, about the other project I talked about is that there was no women's refuge for the Black women. So in 1994, we actually coming up to 30 years now, next year. 95 actually. Excuse me, sorry, I didn't know this was coming.
No. You can take water.
I'll just have a little bit more. 1995, 94, 95, me and myself and some of the other women, we started this, Black and Asian minority ethnic communities refuge,
Right.
which is now grown. We started with three staff members with children in need funding, but now we've grown into really a mainstream, like a very big organization where we yearly help 5,000 women.
Brilliant.
So at the time when we started, it was so new for some of the women. They didn't know how to really stand up for themselves. They were scared. They were always... It happens now as well, but it was more so at the time. The women were... been obviously victim of domestic abuse, but then also being told that, if you step out, then you will lose your children, or you step out, you will be deported because you haven't got the immigration status without me. So all these threats. So they always endured their, they stayed in this abusive relationship. But and then when we started with this Barnardos project, started counseling them, because it's them, they have to come out, they have to stand up, and they have to take the step. So when and then also we had English classes, parenting classes, and computer classes, sewing classes. So they used to come out with these classes, and then the men were really, and also in-laws were really against us. So they obviously then blamed me as a troublemaker. Basically, they think that I'm the one who is breaking their marriages, but it just already that. But I think now I would say. They because of this organization now on in Expand and awareness of the domestic abuse, the services available, and also the women are more confident.
Yes.
And also we working with the local community, with the men organizations, so there's more of awareness. So the women is standing up for themselves is more. So instead of troublemaker, I think we are now enabler. I would say for the group of women we are enabler, and also, but we have many still we have a more journey to make, because I would think that our experience with setting up these refuge is I just find that there is institutionalized racism, as well as we compete with other mainstream, women's aid for funding, and it's really we find a lot of barriers. So and we in Wales we are a lot behind than England. When we visit like Birmingham, London, they're a lot forward. So I think we in Wales need to really improve more, have more work to do as well.
Journey continues.
Yeah,
then.
journey continues, and we are struggling, yes.
But more power to
More
you.
empowering women, women are much easier. Like I said, that we are. I think, whatever we achieved so far, we quite happy, in the community. Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
So could you read from
Something I haven't actually thought until you were asking. So I would say
just freestyle?
just I was saying, thinking I have to take my glasses off because my reading glasses not read. So just I think something with a positive note I wanted to. Positive note. Positive note is that setting up a counseling service, really. In the future, I envision setting up a counseling service for Black and Asian children in Wales. There is no such service in Cardiff at all, and there are so many young Asian people who are grappling with issues such as identity crisis, who have got to communication with their own families, so who have developed mental health issues as a result and of not being able to fit in. So, and and this is what my aim is to achieve.
Please, a round of applause.
Anna, so you had to face a lot of bullying throughout your school, primary and secondary school in Kuching, on account of your visual impairment. Would you say that that was what kind of spurred you on to prove everybody wrong and flourish?
So first of all, I want to say thank you, Faiza, for the opportunity to actually tell my story. And yes, so I have had visual impairment since I was very young. I think as far as I remember, I have been visually impaired, and there was a lot of bullying in school. I was called blind a lot, and it wasn't just from my friends or peers, it was also from teachers, which is very, very sad. My mum was actually advised that I should be put into a special school, and she decided, no, that we're not going to go down that route. And she actually said to me something that stuck to me until now, that in order to fight in this world of able-bodied people, you have to put up the fight, and you have to fight all the way through. If you want to get somewhere, you have to fight. So
Well done, your
there
mum.
was definitely. So there was
My mum did the same, and my dad, yeah.
there was a spur of moment of fire inside me to say, you want to put me down? Let me show you what I can achieve. And I think that fire, the more people put me down, the more I wanted to show what I could do. There was an example, I think the biggest example in my schooling history was my maths teacher, who really put me down. She called me names. You know, she said I needed a big magnifying glass in front of me, that I was blind, I was supposed to go to special school. I remember that day I was really, really upset. And I went back and I told my mum about this. My mum, through her savings, as we didn't have much money growing up in Malaysia, she bought me a telescope to use so I don't get bullied anymore. And I remember going back to school, and I got first in maths for the whole year. And it was really funny because I went into class, and the teacher said, "Who got first?" And everyone looked and pointed at me, and she was really shocked. And you know, I won the best student of the year that year, and my mum came and actually said to the teacher, as we were going on to stage, that my daughter is very strong. Don't do this with someone else. You're supposed to support your students, not put them down. So that fire of sort of keep going kept me on. I think my mom was my biggest supporter in that sense, that she always said, try, just do, try this, try that. If it doesn't work, it's fine. So somehow I finished school. I finished my GCSE equivalent in Malaysia at the age of 16, and came here.
So after you came to Cardiff, you then, after school, after your A levels, you went to university and then qualified as a pharmacist, and you worked as a pharmacist for 10 years, and then you gave it up.
Yes.
And now you work with RNIB.
Yes.
If you were still in Malaysia, do you think you would have ever had any such opportunities? And do you still miss practicing pharmacy?
No. If not practicing pharmacy, I think being in Malaysia, any opportunities in Malaysia would. I don't think there was any opportunity. The hardest thing for me was actually leaving somewhere very familiar, and my mum to come to somewhere very unfamiliar with sight loss, and starting a journey here was the most difficult thing for me. Yeah. But somehow I went through university, did pharmacy, practiced for 10 years. Unfortunately, I lost my sight, a lot of my sight in 2019, so decided that it was time to give up. Silver lining, because COVID came, so I didn't need to go to work, which was nice. And I started working with RNIB. In terms of missing pharmacy, I think Pfizer, some parts of it I miss. The other parts, not so much. The stress and the pressure, no. I miss my interaction with my patients, of course, and helping them. But through my role with RNIB now, I'm still able to empower people with sight loss. I do a lot of outreach work anyway. Talk to people and tell them, anyone going through sight loss, especially younger individuals, that it's not all impossible. You could do it. I have been teaching Bollywood dance as well to visually impaired people. Normal people can join. I always say this: normal people can join. Visually impaired people. I try and do sort of education empowerment as well. So I suppose the silver lining of leaving pharmacy was that I was able to do a lot more. Not just with the knowledge as a pharmacist, but also as an empowerment side of things in terms of my sight, my journey, and what I have achieved and what can be done. So having no spatial awareness and dancing is another thing I'm trying to tell people. Look, it's easily done. I suppose the journey carries on.
Yeah, brilliant. Chinyere, if you could open out the chapter for Anam from Cat City.
I think it's 151.
Yeah, 151.
Sorry about that.
151.
Okay.
Thank you, Chinyere.
I'll just read the first paragraph. Kuching, popularly known as Cat City in Malaysia, this was the only home I knew until I was 16. Historically, it has been part of the Bruneian Empire and had been occupied by the Japanese during World War II, but mercifully escaped destruction. It was and still the capital of Sarawak, which is today part of Malaysia. Apart from its quirky museum of cats, it is also a gastronomic hub recognized by UNESCO. These are just some of the intriguing and at times endearing facts about Kuching. But for me, it was my home. One thing I do miss about Kuching is food.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you can do that now. Thank you.
Okay. Of course.
So
Okay.
I'm good. Okay.
Yeah.
I would like to. Okay, you can introduce
Okay, yeah,
Chandrika.
okay. So we would like to invite Chandrika to the stage and Kate as well. So Chandrika is, so her story is that she came from Uganda to Wales when she was a child. And yeah. This was after Asians in Uganda were asked to leave. And for the past 50 years, she's been in Wales and calls Wales home now. But yeah, we can talk a little more about that. As for Kate, Kate has been has an Anglo-Indian grandmother who sadly is not with us anymore. But her journey started when she started investigating more and more into her grandmother's life when she was still in India. And there are some very endearing stories and some really quite amazing stories as well as part of Kate's story. So we'll learn a little more about that. Chandrika, I just wanted to ask you, you were very young when you came with your family to Uganda. And do you go back to Uganda now often, or do you, how do you find it? If you do go back, how do you find Uganda now? And do you see any trace of what you remember as a child in Uganda?
Well, first of all, I was born in Uganda.
Yeah.
So my parents had emigrated from India and had settled in Uganda, and myself and my brothers and sisters were born in Uganda. I came to this country at the age of 14. So I have really quite vivid memory of life in Uganda. Yeah, and I've never been. Quite frankly, I think my whole half a century in Wales has been about home. You know, what is home? You know, what is, and constantly having to ask myself, I believed at one stage in Uganda also, because we followed Indian culture, although we lived in an African country. And I thought when I go to India, because I'd never been to India, I just like gonna fit in like a jigsaw, it'll be fine. I speak 2 languages, I had long hair, I can wear kurta and pajama and all the rest. And when I first went to India in 1984 or 85, when I was at university, initially it felt like, wow. And then I realized this isn't home. So I really felt that it will be home. And it didn't resonate as home. I could fit in the culture, etc., but it just wasn't what I had lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chandrika, I would like to ask you, because I consider you as a child of many worlds.
Yes.
A touch of Uganda,
Yeah.
a touch of India,
Yeah.
and a very big hug from Wales, because you've spent centuries here. So how has all of this colored your journey as an individual living in Wales? Do you see yourself, the state of double consciousness of different things, So how has it colored your journey? Are there what's the downside of it and the good side of it,
Well, I'm going to say the downside first.
Okay.
So the downside of it is, even now, every time someone talks who has 2 homes, so they might be living in Wales, but they will talk about going back home, whether it's in Nigeria or Pakistan or India, I always get this pang in my heart because I don't have that. Because I had something that I believed was my home, that I belonged to, and it just doesn't exist because we were just kicked out, and my parents had migrated there from India. So although my parents would have felt at home going back to India, for me, home was always that Africa felt like home. But so I always get this pang that, I don't have that, or I don't have a place where I can sort of say, I went to this village where I grew up, and the streets have changed this way or that way. I don't have that.
Okay. So we often believe, this may be a consolation, the home is somewhere we live in one place and it welcomes us in another. Has Wales been welcoming enough since the dislocation or the movement from Uganda?
I would say Wales, if she was a mother, had her arms open and her lap there for me. But it took me a long time to actually embrace that place. So for me, the whole journey of 50 years has been that I am lost. And I was 40, in my mid-40s, where I was working in Bristol at that stage in a hospital, and I had started counseling for the first time. So I was undergoing trauma counseling, and at that stage, I decided that I'm going to leave this job and go back to Wales. And I told myself that Wales is as close as I can get to home. And hence I then left my job, came to Wales, and I remember very vividly walking on Heathholt Road, which is not far from my home in Cardiff, and looking at the hills in the background and telling myself, these were the hills I saw when I was a little girl in Africa, and I could see these hills from my home in the evening. So I started joining these images in my head to say, you know, I went through even spiritually sort of telling myself, oh, the whole world is my home. You know, do I really, you know, there are no boundaries. But you do this kind of thing to compensate and to be able to cope at that stage. But actually having to leave a job and say, I'm going to heal myself now. And that was my beginning of my journey to embrace Wales. And that was about 20 years ago. But it is still a journey that, you know, I still look at the sky and tell myself, this is the same sky I saw when I was a child, because it is. You know, the earth has got boundaries, but hopefully, at least at the moment, the sky doesn't have boundaries, you know? So it's still a journey, and one of the most enlightening things that happened was, I'm a storyteller, so one of the most enlightening thing happened. A friend of mine, Bevan, who is a storyteller, he's Zimbabwean, and Bevan told a story about Magama. Yeah, Bevan told a story at a festival 2 years ago, which was about in 1960s when Ian Smith's government land grabbed and his ancestral land was taken away, and what happened to his grandfather, etc. They all went downhill really fast. And I had this light bulb moment. And although my family came from India to Africa, and it was because it was a British colony, we came, and they didn't grab the land, but it still made me feel, I just felt like, wow, the house I was living in Africa, who did that land belong to before the Asians came and built their homes? And for me, that was a big moment where I suddenly felt that I was born in Africa and I lived there, but was that my home? Because I've gone through 50 years of this craving, this only Welsh has a word, hiraeth, and feeling this pang on a daily basis, and then suddenly feeling like, oh, you know, it just disappeared. Was it real? Was this my home? So I don't know. I mean, I'm still on a journey. I don't know. It's a bit like an existential, you know, question where I feel much more at home now than I ever did. Like when we were coming by the minibus, and I looked at the hills, because I've just come back from India after spending a month there, and I looked at the hills and I thought, oh, it feels really good. So I think this is as close as I can get to home.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, pardon me if I deviate a little bit or maybe spend so much time with her, because I am, you know, I'm drawn into your story. The book is titled Many Roads. I think it comes full circle in your story, because this captures Africa, Asia, Middle East, and Wales. And I know what happens in that kind of condition. There is this sense of exile, this exilic consciousness of, you know, you are in a place,
Yeah.
but you feel like you do not belong.
Yeah.
So finally, on a good note, I would like to ask, and I'm hoping it to be positive, have you found closure? Are you home now?
Have I found closure? I'm as close as I can get to home, but I think there will be, in counseling they talk about loss, that when loss occurs, it's just like a cut in your skin, that it heals, but it leaves a scar behind. So therefore the body defends it and keeps it, it's like, it's still there. So for me, yes, it's healing or it's healed, but there's a scar there. It will never be the way it was, right? So, I feel it's never, it was so complex. I feel it is so complex, particularly because the land I lived in was Africa, in Uganda, and the culture I followed was Indian. And I had a British passport.
Wow.
Right? So
many roads.
And then I had never heard of Wales. So I ended up in Wales, So, yeah.
So in order not to drag the interview longer than it has gone already, out of my personal curiosity, I will see you after. But right now, we would like you to read a little bit from the part of your story that kind of resonates.
Okay. So this is when we first arrived in Tonvanai refugee camp in 1972, when Idi Amin kicked us out. And as soon as we were allocated our huts, we went straight to bed. The next morning, I looked outside our window and stared. I asked myself where all the colors had disappeared to, as everything outside seemed to be soaked in cold, muted gray. I was sure I went to sleep with colors behind my eyes, but now they had all faded away and were replaced with various shades of gray. I have a photograph of me smiling in my favorite blue dress and my brown strapped sandals, surrounded by the teachers and students of our temporary school at the camp. And I wonder if the smile on that girl's face was painted on a mask. The person that I am, and that was the real me, was buried inside that girl's heart. She did come out every once in a while, and then the girl in the blue dress had a panic attack and could not stop shaking.
The blue dress reminds me of Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye.
Oh, right.
Things blue, have a way of connecting. All right, so let's move to Kate.
Kate, so you mentioned in your story that you had a difficult relationship with your grandmother initially, and she found it difficult to understand you and vice versa. But then you started digging deeper into her life and found out some really intriguing aspects of her life. Do you think if she was alive today, your relationship with her would have been on a much more positive keel?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, so my grandmother was Indian, but they immigrated to Africa, but East Africa. So they were in Dar es Salaam, where they had a chicken farm, and that was taken away from them. And due to ill health, they ended up having to come to the UK. But none of this was talked about. I was a kid essentially, it was an Anglo-Indian family in London, but it was a family that didn't talk about the past. And our Indian heritage, our Indian culture was
basically through food and TV. So it was Bollywood and talk.
Z World.
Yeah, and Indian sweets and stuff, but nobody actually talked about the past. So as far as I was concerned, as a child, I was a little bit confused because the whole family revolved around this very, very, very small, frail woman who lived in the front room of my aunt's house, and yeah, everybody, she just had to utter a word and it was done. And nobody questioned it. She was the boss.
The matriarch.
Yes, and I couldn't necessarily understand. I perplexed her. I had learning difficulties. We didn't know what they were at the time. And she couldn't understand why I wasn't growing like the others and becoming adult when I should have been adult, and a child when I should have been a child, and instead my childhood continued into what she believed should have been adult. So it was I loved her, and we would sit for hours and watch Bollywood movies, but we didn't necessarily understand each other at all. If she'd been alive today and she was willing to talk to me about her stories, I think the relationship would have been a lot different.
Yeah.
But by the time we found out what was wrong with me, she'd already passed.
Yeah. So one of the stories that your aunt told you is something which is really quite amazing, where your aunt said that she had gone to India at the time of partition, and her two older sons were on a train that was going into Pakistan, what had then just become Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
And she managed to stop that train from going any further, because if that train had gone into Pakistan, she would have lost her sons.
Yeah, so essentially my Aunt Buddy and my gran were going, they travelled to India. I think it was maybe the last time they went to India, because my gran would always go back and have her children in India in order for her kids to have British passports. So the last time she went back, she essentially... she got off the train, the girls got off the train, the boys, they were playing on the train, didn't get off the train. They didn't realise until the train had started to pull out, so her and one of my aunts stood in front of the train until the other daughter that was with them was able to find the boys and drag them out. I mean, this is a story that I've only recently been told, so it's something that, had I known at the time, I'd have understood, because if she hadn't have stopped that train and they'd have gone into Pakistan, there was no way that they could have got them back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Kate's story is titled A Sari and a Train. So, would you like to read a little bit from your story, please?
Yeah, I'll start at the beginning, because I like to start at the beginning. When I was a child, we would visit my grandmother, a tiny woman who lived in the front room of my aunt's house. Poorly, she would wave from her bed, her hand and arm skeletal, or she would be sitting in a brown leather chair, watching the colours of India. "Come, my girl," she would say, and then give a toothless kiss. She smelled of spices and the inexplicable scent of Parma violets. She was not my favourite person. As a child, I couldn't understand why she didn't get up and move, why she lived in a room in my aunt's house, and why she couldn't go to the toilet on her own. She was, however, sharp in her mind. I remember watching Bollywood movies and eating Indian sweets with her, but she perplexed me. I am told that in my early years I used to speak Urdu with her, but now I have no memory of it. I can recall a few words of Swahili, but the memory of the language is shrouded in mist. Back then, no one knew that I had learning difficulties.
Thank you very much. Moving on.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to now invite Linda Williams and Miranda Mehta on stage, please. So, Linda Linda is actually my neighbor, so I didn't have to look very far to find her story. She is from originally Zimbabwe, and then moved to South Africa. And then came to the UK to work. And then she met her husband, and then she's moved to various places, including New Zealand, after she got married. But then finally, she came back. She came to Aberystwyth and then moved to New Zealand, and then came back to Aberystwyth. And this is something that Aberystwyth does to you, doesn't let you go.
Yeah.
So, so her story is called Here, There, and Everywhere, and the long journey to Wales, basically. And Miranda, her story is called Floundering in the Dark. And maybe Chinyere, if you would like to introduce Miranda to us.
So Miranda is a community leader. She works with Klaes Cymru. And she's been doing a lot of she's an advocate on patients having a voice, giving feedback, talking about their struggles with the NHS and all of that. She has also been able to, build relationships across the charity sector in order to get to the people who are actually more or less like their clients. And as an individual, she's a coach. She's into women empowerment, girls empowerment. She talks so much about corporate life and all of that. So
And
this
Miranda
is Miranda
from
Mehta
Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe.
Yes.
Yeah. Did I do good with that introduction?
You did, yes.
All right. So, you want to start with Linda?
So Linda, you said you grew up in apartheid South Africa. And could you tell us a little more about what it was like at the time, and to what extent it was, in every aspect of your day-to-day life?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that when you look at me, I don't look like a typical immigrant. I'm white, I'm English speaking, but I've actually immigrated, as Faiza said, 3 times now. So I was born in Rhodesia, when it was still Rhodesia.
Yes.
And then we left in the early 70s when I was very young. We fled for our lives. My grandparents had a dairy farm out there that was confiscated from them. So, kind of almost full circle, really, from what had happened when it became Rhodesia. So then it became Zimbabwe. And then I moved down to South Africa. And then I left there when I was 21. And living there, my mum is Dutch, my dad was English, and my mum always taught us to treat people the way they treat you. Where they came from, what they looked like, what the colour of their skin was completely irrelevant. But I grew up in the time of apartheid where it was entrenched in the legislation, and it never made sense to me. I just couldn't get on with it at all. Where I could go and visit my friends. I had friends who were Indian, I had friends who were mixed race. I could go and see them in their areas. They couldn't come and see me in my area. I went to university. I don't recall going to university with anybody other who wasn't white. It didn't make any sense to me at all, and it was one of the main reasons why I left. I could go to the beach. The beaches were segregated, so the best parts for the white people, the slightly worse parts for the Indian, and then the worst parts for the African people. The benches, they would have signs on them, blancas net, only white people, or not, and none of it made any sense to me at all. So once I finished university, I left, ostensibly to do a year out, to do my travelling like my sister had done the year before, and to come back. And the longer I was away, the less I wanted to go back to the way it was. So, and the other contributor said about not kind of having anywhere to belong. So Rhodesia, the country I had my childhood in, was no more. The South Africa that I had my entire schooling career and my education till I was 21 was no more. When I was in the UK. I spent 10 years in London. Nelson Mandela came out of jail. South Africa changed. South Africa is a completely different country, so that doesn't exist anymore. So I have no home to go back to either. So after 10 years in London, we then moved to Aberystwyth. We decided it was time for a family. London's not really any place. So I've been in Aberystwyth since 2002, and then we had a little sojourn for 2.5 years to New Zealand. And then, as you say, Aberystwyth has a way of bringing you back. All my children were born in Aberystwyth. All my children, I have 3. They consider themselves Welsh. They're very proud to be Welsh. My husband is a Londoner, as I said, so I consider him, he's English. But my daughter was very clear. She's at university now. Of all the 5 that she was accepted to, she wanted to go to university in Wales. She feels well. She's at Cardiff University. My other 2 children consider themselves Welsh. So we're a very very mixed household.
Yeah. To what extent do you feel that you're part of Aberystwyth life, society, everything now?
Well, we're business owners, so we own an antique shop in town, and that really helps to entrench you into the community. Aberystwyth is very lucky. We have lots of local independent businesses. There are lots and lots of us around, so that really gives you a sense of feeling and a sense of belonging. Having been here having had my children here, so the friends that you make at school, at high school, and afterwards, they're the same friends that I made when I was, from expecting my first child, who she's 21 now. Yeah. So we've definitely been welcomed. I mean, Aberystwyth does feel like a home, a great home, but where for me, the same as you, where is home? I have my life is split into halves. The first half was the African half, and then the second half has been the UK kind of the English half, and now 22 years in Wales, which is the kind of the Welsh bit as well. Okay. Yeah.
So I would like to ask, because you said something, and my knowledge of apartheid South Africa, and how things panned out in South Africa. I know that till date there are 2 places in South Africa, though within the South African country there are a white only countries within the country where black people do not get into, and you complained about not being able to meet with your friends because you are all in segregated areas, and then coming to Wales and feeling a sense of loss being away from Africa. So your children identify as as Welsh.
Yes.
So I want to know for you, which part of all these places is closest to home?
I would say growing up on my grandparents' farm in Rhodesia, I would say under the African sky, the thunderstorms that you can only get in Africa, feeling that sun on your skin as a child, running around barefoot, those are kind of my strongest, I'd say most nostalgic memories for me. But it's almost like it was so long ago it happened to a different person, almost.
And it no longer exists.
No. My soul is African, I would say, for sure. My soul is African, and the rest of me is European. My mum's Dutch, my dad's English, so the rest of me is European, but my soul is African.
Wow.
I'll keep it brief. I know it's been long.
Sorry, but don't worry about it.
No. The one that I think, the bit that resonates the most with me is when people ask me, where are you from? And I've alluded to feeling sort of in 2 halves, but, Born in Rhodesia, schooled in South Africa, Dutch mother, English father, British husband, Welsh children, lived in New Zealand, but essentially more than half my life in the UK. What does that make me? Global or just plain lucky?
So before I move to Miranda, I consider you a global citizen that has traversed many lands. All right, so Miranda, before I get to the stories, the questions selected by Faiza, I would like to ask something, because you are an advocate of corporate life, of the place of black women in corporate life, empowerment, how we should strive to achieve the best of ourselves. But you and I know that sometimes reality is quite tough. And there seems to be this struggle between passion and survival. I'll give an example. So I'm a passionate writer, but my writing is a seasonal job that can't put food on the table or pay all my bills. So I have to maybe, for example, get into the mental health sector in order to work a full-time job and pay the bills, while in the night, whatever time I can get, I write. So the best part of me that I most resonate with is suffering, while the other side of me that I do not connect with in any way is striving. How has that helped, been your story? Because I know that you're passionate about so many things, but you're working in a sector.
Okay.
This is something we've talked about, so I want you to shed light.
I think it's just about, firstly, like what you've said, you identify that, or you recognize that you've got purpose. And you sort of like having that conversation with self, but understand that's a journey of conversation. So that is to say, this is what I'm passionate about, and this is what I probably need to get there, to get there. But in the interim, there's still other things that need to happen. And then the thing is, how do you reconcile the two? It's always going to be a battle. And I think where we sort of like maybe can often be found guilty of letting ourselves down is the bit where we struggle then with the reconciliation. The bills become overwhelming, life happens, and then we suddenly forget that we've got a passion. It's almost like setting your goals in January, and then some weird day in September, you think, oh my gosh, I set this goal in January and I forgot all about it because life happened. So it's about creating those structures that allow you to still tap into that, but also I think you probably then need to then create a strategy of how do you then transition. So for example, you're a writer, that's what you're passionate about. But then you would need to have a plan, because without intentionality, you're not going to get to the ultimate place where you want to get to. And that's probably, how I've probably maybe reconciled some of the difficult positions that I've been in, constantly reminding myself of who am I and what do I want to be known by, but understanding that maybe in that moment in time that I've still got responsibilities. I don't live necessarily for myself. There are people that I represent and that I'm responsible for, whether that's intentional or by force through things like black tax.
Okay. Yeah. So you have been somebody who encourages mothers on parenting, and your journey is such that you didn't plan motherhood. Some of us are called to motherhood. Some actually plan and walk into motherhood, but for you it happened. But you were able to find your feet along the way. So I would like to ask, how has the journey been? And the child that actually taught you to take the baby steps of becoming a mother at a very young age, what has been the journey? What has been the progress? How have you been able to overcome all of that?
When I was young, I was forced to babysit. So my cousins would come over, and as the oldest, you'd be forced to babysit. And I think I was about 12, and I told myself, I'm never going to have children. I don't want children. They're noisy. Nobody's got time for this. I'm going to get married to a rich man. We're going to spend our time traveling. And that was the plan. And at 17, I fell pregnant. And I think between the fear of my mother and the disappointment, and actually realizing that I had lived instead life, and now I had a child who I didn't actually envisage that I would have. I think that in itself was difficult. But I think what compounded it was the fact that I'd only arrived in Britain when I was 16 as almost an unaccompanied minor. So as I was still navigating the system, trying to figure out what to do, I now had the complexity of being pregnant and deciding that I needed to keep the child. But then what were we supposed to do after we've had the child? Because I didn't have the support of almost having the family home to go back to. But I understand that I was still the firstborn in my family, so school fees needed to be paid back home. Black tax it is what it is. But also figuring out what am I going to do with this child and what becomes of my life, because when we were growing up, you would be told that the one thing that you must never do in an African home is get pregnant. And so I was like, what happens to me now? Who am I? Will I accomplish those things that I aspired? Being the jet-setting baby girl that I'd envisaged myself to become. And so that in itself, I think, was very difficult. But then I think the foundation in which I was brought up in was very strong. And I had I'm very courageous. And I always think that I deserve all things, but I'm also very much aware that I have to work for those things. And so the journey in itself hasn't been easy. My son is 21 now, he's in university. And a lot of it has been sort of like taking stock at different times of my life, having the journey to go through in terms of finding myself, finding my place in society, and almost recognizing that at different spaces we navigate different wars. So for example, because I've fallen pregnant so young, it means that my child is hanging around with people who are married, who automatically think that because I'm a single parent, I want to sleep with their husband, and so my child doesn't belong there. But my friends are turning up, going to the club, but I'm sitting at home with my child. And so you find that there is actually no place for you to be, and this is why I advocate so much for empowerment, because I understand what it is like to be lost. Not because perhaps you're lost, but perhaps there is no spot for you. And sometimes all that it takes is a little bit of redirection and encouragement. And I think recognizing that has been my journey, and also recognizing that in itself is a journey that requires you to take stock and make decisions and perhaps have conversations like, for example, how am I going to raise this child? He lives in a society that is very different from me. So I remember my son would go to school and come back and said, Mama had dinner. And I didn't understand what he was talking about, because I'd be like, how do you have dinner? I picked you up at 3 o'clock, because when in Zimbabwe, dinner is like, it's an evening meal. And so, you're going through all these things and navigating a culture in a different way, yes, of doing things, but then having to make the decision to say, how do I raise this child in a way that doesn't deny him of the fact that ultimately he is British, and this is what he knows, but I still need to instill certain bits in terms of where we've come from. And how do you do that?
Okay. So my second to the last question, because I resonate with your story very much, is this. In Africa, we often say that we leave home to feed home. And there are people in the family who are not allowed to break. Because when they break, the entire family breaks. Like firstborn children, it's like a generational trauma, like a burden you carry. Once you leave the continent, everybody expects you to pick up a lot of bills and responsibilities, and before you know it, you're working to feed every other person, losing your dreams, losing yourself, just to make sure that you put food on the table. And sometimes we are like the child of the community, because a lot of people would have contributed to make sure that this one person escape this level of life. So I would like to know, have you been able to rise above all of that? Because while nursing a child, you still had to cater to the people back home.
Yes, but it came at a cost. I think, you get to a point whereby you've got to make a decision in terms of, this is my life and I need to own it. And so I said that my responsibility was to educate my siblings, and after that it was up to them. Once I recognized that I'm probably sitting in a place of privilege because I'm here, what I also didn't want to do was to disempower them. So my conversation with them is, if you've got a business idea, you've got something that you're doing, that's great and wonderful. But you bring 50% to the table, and I'll bring 50% to the table. It's the same principle that I apply with my son. I'm not going to spoil you. My job is to teach you how to fish. And so you have to be willing to be taught how to fish. And so my breaking point probably came when it was decided that my brother was going to go to university in South Africa. And all these things were made. And now they said to come and tell the sponsor, i.e. me, that this is what they had done. And I just thought, I want to go to school and do my master's, but I can't afford to. And I had to put my foot down, and it came at a cost. It really strained the relationship between my mother and I, because she said to me, when I was growing up, my older brother did this, so I don't see why you've got a problem with doing that. And I was like, but the circumstances are different. I've got a child who needs me, and so you're almost asking me to take out money that should feed him to feed someone else. And respectfully, these are your children. They're your responsibility. I can support, but it shouldn't be for me to have a sleepless night. And so I think for about a good 5-6 years, the relationship was strained, but I stood my ground. And even now, even though my mom has passed away, I'm still viewed as being a very difficult child. They call me now the +44, which means I am British, because I'm not that type of person who will entertain certain things, because I learned that if I'm to be truly authentic to myself, which is to be a woman who lives a legacy for her child, then I need structures, but I also need money that allows me to do that. It's all well and good coming to Britain and living here, but if I don't create the structures that I saw when I came here, but also perhaps also the structures that I didn't have access to because Zimbabwe became what it became. So if I'm to do that, then I need to put those structures, and I need to be selfish, because ultimately I'm all that he has.
Okay. On a final note, I know you have dreams to travel the world, but I would like you to bring two questions together. Being the person you are and all the burdens you have to carry and the responsibilities that you have to shoulder, sometimes in the corporate sector you may come across as doing too much, as being too overachieving, as being too ambitious. Nobody sees the driving force that makes you be the way you are, and some of the things you've been through, that is almost like you're in competition with yourself to be better in order to take up more responsibilities and do more for the people you love. So number one, how have you been able to navigate that? And then secondly, have you been able to travel the world and sponsor yourself now that there is no rich husband?
I think you just have to have a vision. I think ultimately you have to decide that this is the life that I want to have, and I'm going to work for it. Unfortunately, the reality is that I'm black, I'm a woman, I have to go to work, and I have to work twice as hard as other people. That's very much an accepted norm. The level playing field is not level. But regardless of that, I always tell myself that I deserve all things, all good things. The good things in life, I deserve them. And I'm not shy to work for those things. And I'm also not apologetic in the workplace. Some people might call me gobby. Some people might call me opinionated. But it is what it is. We're coming here. I've been commissioned to do a job, and I'm here to do my job. And if I don't like something, or I don't approve of something, or I think that perhaps there's something that's not going quite right, I will vocalize it. Because at the end of the day, if I don't speak, who will? I work in an environment whereby you sit in meetings where you're the only black person, and then you sit in also the same meetings where people have never interacted with someone who's black, and then people say to you things like, oh my God, you speak really good English. And I'm like, but you came and you colonized us. How can you ask me such a simple question like that? So I think I've learned to own it. You have to own your journey. And so you have to take up space wherever you go. And for me, it's also about the legacy that I leave for my child. Because when my son sees me winning, he knows that it's possible. Because there'll be times where I recognize that I won't always be here, but what my child will have would be the legacy. So in the moments where he sits down and thinks, how do I navigate this? I want him to be able to say, what would my mother have done? And then look at my life and be inspired to push through.
Have you traveled to Paris?
Yes, I have.
I just want to know.
We have traveled. We've been to South Africa this year. I turned 40. The girls took me on a surprise trip to Croatia. So yeah, I have traveled. I'm now tired of the airport officially.
I'm glad you're giving that dream to yourself. All right. So a little bit, it could be 2-3 lines or any. Yeah.
Okay. So my hesitation was founded on the fact that my father had died about 4 years earlier, and I did not want to leave my mother. My mother was a victim of the classic behavior of extended family members in Zimbabwe who wanted to strip her of everything my father had left behind. She was at the receiving end of countless family schemes and unwanted advances from men who would not dared to look in the eyes when my father was alive. However, through the experience, she found the strength to hold on and fight. And I think and I'd like to think that I derived my strength from her.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So we invite our remaining authors to please come to the stage. Sorry. Yeah, you can go.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Susan Chong. Go the rest.
Osana and Latifa, Suzanne and Osana and Latifa are here as well. And but it's only if they want to say a few words because they weren't sure whether they wanted to come up. But
All right. All right, so let's quickly get on it.
Yeah.
All right. So this is our final batch.
Okay, Osana is.
Are you okay?
Would you like
All right, thank you. All right.
Yes, yes. Okay, so Latifa Najjar is known to quite a few of us who live in Aberystwyth. She's from Syria originally, but she is the person who heads the Syrian Dinner Project at Aberystwyth and does some amazing catering for all of us. So we enjoy her food. And she has basically made loads of friends in Aberystwyth and formed this new network. And the question that we will ask her in due course is, whether Wales now feels like her new home. But she's been here for 9 years?
8 years.
8 years. 8 years now in Aberystwyth.
Yeah.
And Triniara, would you like to introduce Suzanne?
Susan Chong is a woman of many abilities. She is a child of many worlds. With her, China, Hong Kong, Scotland, Canada comes full circle, and she teaches Qigong, Tai Chi, and a lot of other activities, and has also done a lot of service with the Chinese in Wales Association at the Grand Theatre in Swansea. She'll be saying more about herself as we proceed. Thank you.
Okay, so Latifa, first of all, I would like to thank you because Latifa has provided us with some delicious Syrian eats outside after the event, so please do enjoy those.
My pleasure.
So would you like to tell us a little more about the Syrian Dinner Project? Before that, I would also like to say that Latifa has been on the Kitchen Cabinet on BBC Radio 4 recently, talking to none other than Jay Rayner. So, talking about Syrian Dinner Project.
I'm Latifa, come on 2016 to here with my family, and I live here. I have a lot of friends, and they are support me and push me and my another friends to start Syrian Dinner Project on 2019, and we working by one, like we are team, but we are like one hand. And we cooking from love, from our heart, because here we have warm welcoming from local here. And we started on 2019 in Medina restaurant for do Syrian food and for 120 people, and this making us just scared and how to start, how to cook. Maybe the people like it or not, but everyone happy and like it and push us to do and give us supporting and helping to we are now cooking and we have small business and working with lovely people. Our business not just for money or something, no, just cooking and sharing something here for lovely community and good people here. Thank you.
Thank you. And so you feel like Aberystwyth is now like your second home?
Yeah, I'm feeling second home, and I feeling big different. When I came to here, it's big different. Like feeling I am maybe in future happy or not. I am so happy with my family and feeling second home and feeling good.
Yeah.
All right.
You
Thank
recently also met your your brothers and your sisters in Egypt.
Yeah,
after 9 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you could not travel until you had the leave to remain. And
like a dream. When I saw them, like a dream. I think after nine years, I didn't see them. I wait for citizenship and passport. I told them about Wales and my children, and my little boy said, "I am Welsh," and football. Also, it's warm time in Egypt and good time with my family. Yeah.
Yeah, very emotional.
I can't believe I saw them after that.
A round of applause for All right, so let's get to Susan. Susan, I would like to ask, you are somebody that has traveled to different places and been to different places from birth to this very moment, and you actually have a twin, and you titled your story BBC 2, Black, British, I'm sorry.
Proud to be Chinese.
Proud to be, no, BBC, the full name.
BBC 2, Proud to be Chinese.
Proud to be Chinese, okay. Though there's a mix of Canada, Scotland, and all of that.
Yeah.
So I want to know how all of that has influenced you and how you were able to still hold on to your Chinese culture, because you teach a lot of Chinese heritage activities like Qigong and Tai Chi, which are very strong routines. So tell us about that.
So I actually grew up I was born in Scotland because my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was in Scotland. So my mom got a bit scared when she was pregnant and she wanted to go back to Scotland because my parents were actually working in Canada at the time. So after I was born, my grandma decided, because my other cousins are also twins and they're also girls as well, she thought, oh my God, it's like deja vu. So my dad asked her mom to look after us, so we flew to Hong Kong. And then afterwards, I think I was 3, we moved back to Canada. And growing up, Canada is advertised as a multicultural country, a melting pot, but there is still a lot of discrimination there. So the fact that me and my sister knew a different language, we spoke Cantonese. That was our kind of secret language when we wanted to talk to each other and not let the bullies know what we're saying. Like formulating a getaway plan if they were bullying us. But when we turned 12, we actually moved back to Scotland. And even though Scotland, we thought, it would be great because it was called United Kingdom. And from Canada, we're like, wow, this sounds like a really magical place with castles and stuff, right? Because it's called a kingdom. But actually, obviously, we didn't know what it meant. But when we moved back to Scotland, we also had a lot of discrimination from being Chinese on the outside, but also using Canadian jargon, like a sidewalk or like a full stop, like that. We used American English, not British English, so we got picked on for things like that as well. But as I grew up, I always loved watching Chinese films and TV, and I was quite happy that I was born as a Chinese person because I felt I liked the culture, And even though there was a lot of discrimination, I felt it's what made me unique, and I wanted to share what I loved about Chinese culture with those around me. So after going to Edinburgh University, I decided to move to Wales because that's where my aunt was and my boyfriend, which is now my husband, was from. So through my interest in Chinese culture, I actually felt it was my job as a Chinese person to learn Chinese, Cantonese, and also Mandarin as well from listening to songs, watching TV series with subtitles, you know, and picking up Chinese that way. And then I actually one time got a chance to learn Tai Chi, and that looked pretty cool in the movies when I was watching as a kid. So I'm actually now a qualified instructor with the British Health Qigong Association. Wow. I competed in China last year. We came 4th overall as Great Britain, but we technically came first as a country outside of China. So we did really well.
Susan is someone that is very passionate about Chinese heritage, and she has proudly been, you know, teaching people, helping a lot of people who don't know about culture to achieve cultural competency on everything Chinese. And on the final note, Susan, I would like to ask, has there been any form of new events, new happenings as a progression from your story, BBC Two?
Yeah, well...
and how is the two?
Oh, I forgot to explain. So BBC Two, I know it's the channel, but also it means British Born Chinese. Two, because I'm the second twin. My older sister is BBC One. So I'm BBC
So she's a twin.
Yes. But in between, I got to teach the local Chinese community, Qigong and Tai Chi, also the Iranians and Latin American community. At primary schools, I've taught in corporate. I taught for Swansea Council. So yes, and the African Community Centre on their Harmonise project, which I was a youth worker for when I was working at the Chinese and Wales Association. I currently work as a civil servant, and at my workplace I also advertise ethnic minority events that I know about, including classes that I'm currently running in Swansea, because I set up my own business called Lotus Chi Wellbeing. And even I've been asked to do like crafts like origami as well, and Chinese bracelet knotting. So I want to, what I do is I want to advocate for the Chinese culture. I want to share it with the local community members and get them to kind of accept that other cultures are pretty cool as well, you know. So yeah, I'm hoping I've inspired some people and shared this beautiful culture with others.
Okay.
Can you
just quickly before we go, because we've run out of time.
Okay, so there was this bit relates to another person's quote from the book. Today, people still comment on my English, whether it is my Canadian twang or simply surprised that I, a Chinese person, can speak English so well. Yeah, because a lot of people go like, oh, where are you from? And like, wow, your English is really good. But they feel Chinese people were born in China, which is really weird in nowadays, right? But people still do that. So they still ask me that. Another one. This kind of sums it up. British born, Hong Kong, Canada, Scotland raised, and thriving in Swansea, I have chosen to promote my Chinese heritage. I do so by adding a Chinese flavour to all my arts and crafts and by sharing my Tai Chi and Qigong learning. My various influences have given me a richer and fuller experience as I promote my Chinese heritage. Thank you very much.
Give a round of applause. A round of applause for all our writers. And to those of you who are unable to come to the stage and say
like to read a little bit.
Okay, because I was told to.
Yeah.
All right, quickly.
I want to know which pages are stored. That's my book.
Oh, it's my country. So it's, I think it's the... Do you want to have a look?
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Would you like to read a bit?
You can read from anywhere.
Yeah, read from anywhere if you wish.
I love living here. Some of our family is favorite place to visit in Wales are the Elan Valley and Devil Bridge. The views from this location are absolutely breathtaking, and they never fail amaze me.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, everyone, just to give a little background, some of the stories were told in different languages but written in English. So some of them were like translations and all of that. But they actually have the voices of the women behind the stories. I would like to give a round of applause to all our writers. Those who are unable to come to the stage and those who just wanted to be part of this celebration while we launch.
Yeah, so I would just like to say that we have another contributor here as well, but she's said that she would like to listen. It's Osana Peters, who's from Zambia. And she actually changed her travel plans so that she could be here to attend this event with us today. Thank you so much, Osama.
Thank you. Yeah, so with that beat, I think we draw the curtains to the launch of Many Roads. Thank you. Thanks very much,
everyone, for coming.
Tell your friends, tell your colleagues, tell your village people that Many Roads have come to stay. Thank you.